G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and here's a dangerous question for you. Will there be an all-out war with Iran? Does Israel want an all-out war with Iran? What exactly is Netanyahu's strategy at the moment? What will become of Lebanon, of Hezbollah? Is there a plan for Gaza? Is the two-state solution even feasible anymore? In this week, the one-year anniversary of the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel, there's a lot of chattering about who's right, who's wrong. Has Israel been justified in its response? How can we kind of play the sides off each other? And I wanted to take a drink from a cool, refreshing mountain stream. And anytime I want to take a drink from a cool, refreshing, intellectual mountain stream, I turn to one of my oldest, closest friends, Marcus Walker, who is a reporter, a senior reporter at the Wall Street Journal based in Europe. He used to run their economics coverage, including during the financial crisis and during the Eurozone crisis. And he went and lived in Greece and reported from the front lines there. He's a fluent German speaker, so he's interviewed Angela Merkel and reported from Berlin. And he has been being sent to Israel. He's now based in Rome, where he runs the Southern Europe bureau for the journal. But he's been being sent to Israel to do some really interesting deep dives for the Wall Street Journal, for mainly it's American readers, into what's going on, giving context there. His recent article is entitled "Israel's Invasion Gamble Risks a Quagmire in Lebanon." And he had an essay prior to that entitled "Netanyahu's War, the Tactics of a Political Survivor." I highly recommend Marcus's reporting in the Wall Street Journal. It's brilliant. He's not a neocon. He's not an Israeli hawk. He's not a Rupert Murdoch hack. He's a really, really thoughtful and well-informed English guy, Oxbridge educated and generally sort of a bit of a European lefty, but with a deep understanding of where Israel's head is at. He's interviewed all of the major players in Israel, and he spent enough time there in recent months to understand the conflict in a way that I could not possibly. I thought it would be useful to get his perspective on the sort of 30,000-foot view of where we've been, where we are, and where we are going. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. The one, the only, Marcus Walker. Let's get going. So how many times have you been to Israel since October 7th? Do you know?
So I've now done 4 long stints in Israel.
How long's long?
Well, it starts to feel long after about 2 weeks. I've been there, been staying there.
No offense to the Israelis, but
it must feel very long for them.
Yeah,
I've been, so I've been there for about three weeks at a time, but also I've been editing coverage from afar. So I've been involved as an editor as well as a writer on the ground.
Yes, right.
October 7th.
And is this mainly just because a big news organization like the Wall Street Journal, although they have a lot of people in the Middle East, don't have so many to cover the magnitude of everything that's been going on? So they bring in trusted people like you.
Exactly. When there's a story this huge, then it's often all hands on deck, and they ask the experienced foreign correspondents to go and help the local bureau, which is often extremely stretched, getting no sleep at all.
And so what's your general sense of the arc of the past 12 months as you've been popping in and out?
From what point of view? From the...
I guess what it feels like to be there. Like, I assume we can imagine what it was like on your first trip, everybody traumatized, still in the wake of trying to grapple with a calamity. But are they still in that mode? The Israelis on the street, the Israelis who you talk to, or is it too hard to generalize about a big, complicated society?
I would say it's still like that. There is still a sense of this being a trauma, and the anniversary of October 7 has also perhaps refocused people's attention on that. People have talked about what happened once again, but the sense of trauma has been there throughout the past year. Israel is a country still traumatized by this. And it is an open wound also because there are still 101 hostages in Gaza who were taken that day. So, no.
Well, there are still 101 hostages missing. We don't know how many of them are alive in Gaza, do we?
That's the number that's thought to be in Gaza who were taken that day. So it is thought that as few as half might still be alive at this point.
Right.
But of course, the Israelis want all of their people back, or at least many of the Israelis, and I'm sure we'll come to that because it's an extremely divisive point. But overall, I would say it is still very, very fresh in the memory. This has not receded into the past at all. So, and this has left the country in a traumatized mood, and also very divided about how it came about and about the government's handling of it since.
Yeah, well, I mean, the government's handling of it since is what I find curious, and I'm curious about how locals think about it, because I saw some poll being quoted the other day on the anniversary of October 7th that happened in the week after October 7th, saying, how long do you think the military campaign as a result of this is going to last? And it was like, the majority of Israelis thought it was going to be over within 3 months, whatever Israel was going to do in Gaza. And the number who thought it was going to still be a fully fledged military campaign a year later was vanishingly small. It was like a few percentage points or something. Do they retain a sense of surprise?
It became clear, I would say, sometime around the beginning of this year that this was going to be a very long war with no end in sight. I think that is indeed, that was a surprise to many people, because early on there was a sense of there being a ticking clock for Israel to take military action against Hamas in Gaza. Early on, there was a sense of an international ticking clock, which was very short, i.e. the wider world would tolerate an offensive against Hamas, but as brief as possible. Then there was an American clock, which was giving more latitude to the Israelis, but not too much. Biden also wanted this to be really over by the end of last year. But then there was Netanyahu's clock. And this is why many people in Israel would say we've ended up with a much longer war, because he has been following a political strategy of playing for time in order to change the narrative and really create the foundation for his own political comeback. And fourthly, there's an Israeli military clock, which is not as long as Netanyahu's, but longer than the American, because the Israeli military thought that it's going to take at least a year to complete their military goal of destroying Hamas as a significant military force that can threaten Israel again. So I think a lot of the story in the past year can be seen as being about the tensions between these four different timetables that these different groups had in mind.
That's an interesting way of putting it. So just on the military clock, when you say that they knew that it was going to take a year to be able to destroy Hamas's military capabilities, has that goal been achieved?
Pretty much. I mean, it depends how high you set the bar, but many people in the Israeli military have been open to a ceasefire for some time now. They've said, look, we're pretty much done here. We've really reduced them to lots of isolated guerrilla cells. They're no longer a functioning army that could launch a large-scale attack like October 7th anymore. The idea of eliminating them totally, as Netanyahu says, keeps saying, total victories is the goal, is not shared by the generals. They think that's unrealistic. And for some time now, they've been saying, look, we're at the point where the threat to Israel from Hamas is dismantled, and it's time to do a ceasefire deal and get our hostages back. And this has been, I would say this was the story for the last few months until the latest escalation in Lebanon, which has really changed the conversation completely in Israel.
Yeah, and so from the outside, it's hard to know how much of the latest escalation is attributable to the Netanyahu clock, in the sense that he doesn't want to go down in history as the man who allowed October 7th to happen, so he needs to build up some other narrative about himself that will drown out that failure, and how much this is a strategic Israeli clock or goal of, like, if October 7th taught us anything, it's that we can't keep kicking the can down the road. We've reached the end of the road. That this is an intolerable situation, and we have to act on it. We have to think about this on a much grander scale than simply addressing Hamas in Gaza. We have to get real about the dangerous territory that we live in and start confronting Iran and degrading
it's
Hamas
a mix
and
of
all
both.
that. I mean, Hezbollah.
Yeah, it's absolutely a mix of both. And there are, on the strategic side first, perhaps, there are, long-term and sort of post-October 7 ways of looking at it. In the long term, Israel has been facing the growing strength and missile arsenal of Hezbollah for many, many years, since the rather unsuccessful 2006 Israeli war in Lebanon, where they tried to punish Hezbollah for kidnapping and killing Israeli soldiers and really drive them away from the border. They didn't achieve very much except for a UN resolution that was never implemented.
And just clarify that UN resolution, that conflict between Israel and Lebanon ended with a resolution that said what?
It said that Hezbollah should retreat away from the Lebanon-Israel border and should actually be dismantled. And the Lebanese government army, so the army of the state of Lebanon, should be the one to protect the south of Lebanon, not this, armed Shia militia backed by Iran. And that resolution 1701 from the Security Council was the only thing Israel really won from that short war in 2006, and it was never implemented. Instead, Hezbollah became stronger and stronger. In the intervening periods, many of its soldiers went to fight in the Syrian civil war and played a big role in shoring up the power of Assad. Hezbollah expanded and became less of a guerrilla or terrorist army and more of a conventional army, a quasi-conventional army, which was also heavily armed in the years after that by Iran, including with a missile arsenal that's bigger than that of most NATO countries.
Okay, so the last time that there was an all-out conflict a hot conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, as you said, it ended with the United Nations resolution, and the status quo henceforth was supposed to be that there are no Hezbollah rockets in southern Lebanon that can threaten Israel. That just never gets enforced, and I guess Hezbollah and Iran call Israel's bluff and assume that they're not going to want to re-invade after a long and painful invasion, and they're right. And so Israel just allows this build-up of massive weaponry in southern Lebanon. But why is the opportunity to take it out taken now?
Yeah. So, obviously, October 8th last year is an important moment here. The day after Hamas's attack on Israel, Hezbollah started firing missiles at a strip of land in northern Israel. And that was sort of joining but not joining the war, showing solidarity with Hamas and putting one foot into the water without wading in fully. Because Hezbollah didn't want this war to happen now. They weren't ready for it. It's not their war, it wasn't their decision. But they sort of felt they had to support Hamas to some extent. And for many, many months, this became a limited war in both directions.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Marcus, but presumably they also knew that they could get away with it to an extent that they couldn't on October 6th, because Israel had another concern on its hands. I mean,
absolutely.
It's a strike of opportunism, presumably, to go, well, they're not going to start diverting all of their focus on dealing with Hezbollah in the north after what's just happened in the south. So, let's take some pot shots while we have the freedom to.
Yes, absolutely. And the Israelis believe that Hezbollah was preparing its own attack on northern Israel. They believe they found their intelligence gathering has shown that there was such a plan to launch a ground attack on northern Israel too, but at a time of Hezbollah's choosing. So Nasrallah wanted to fight this, on his terms when he wanted.
Nasrallah was the head of Hezbollah.
Nasrallah was the longtime head of Hezbollah from the early 90s onwards, and who was assassinated in September. And so in the past year, Nasrallah thought that he could fight a limited war against Israel, chucking missiles at military and civilian targets in a narrow band of northern Israel, which depopulated that band. It forced the evacuation of the population. And
so how many people are we talking about there?
So the Israeli government, organized the evacuation of about 60,000 people, but possibly several tens of thousands others, civilians, left the north of Israel. So a whole strip of land was becoming depopulated, and now Israel's a very small country.
Do you know how many have left the southern Israel since October 7th?
I don't know how many have come back. But both the population of what Israelis call the Gaza envelope, so the communities around the borders of Gaza, that was obviously, devastated and then evacuated, and the north too was evacuated. So Israel had lost, habitable, safe land at both ends.
So just to reiterate for people, this is a country the size of a postage stamp in the first place, and I think we obviously think that, of course, in and around Gaza, it's understandably a shit show. But I don't think a lot of people reflect on the fact that then you've also lost this significant chunk of habitable land in the north, and you've got 60,000 plus people. So those ones who were forcibly evacuated by the Israeli government for their own safety to get them out of range of Hezbollah rockets, or rather into the range of Israelis' missile defense shield. Those people are where? Still living in hotels on the taxpayers' dime?
Yep,
in
many of
central
them are.
Israel?
Many of them are, yeah. But by the way, the zone that was targeted by Hezbollah was often targeted with Russian Kornet missiles, which are small anti-tank missiles in origin that fire line of sight. So they're laser guided and they fire at you in a straight line. They can't be intercepted by Iron Dome. So there's no defense against them, really. And
right, because they don't go up in the air.
No. They go straight close to the ground and blow up your house. And Hezbollah was firing them at, the kibbutzes along the northern border, and that's why people had to leave. It was no longer safe. And so that was the main weapon, really, these Russian missiles that made it impossible to live up there safely.
So the Russians are selling them to the Iranians, and the Iranians are giving them to Hezbollah?
It seems that way, yes.
Right.
Yes. The weapons seem, by and large, to come from Iran, but the manufacturer is Iranian or Chinese or Russian for most of their arsenal. Yeah. Now you mentioned, a shit show around Gaza. I mean, yes and no. The people who lived there on the Israeli side thought that they were protected by the Israeli military. They didn't think that they would be vulnerable to this kind of attack. And this is, you asked about the mood. This is, I think, a very important part of the mood. People feel abandoned. People felt, they couldn't understand how this could happen, how the Israeli state and military and the vaunted intelligence services could fail to see this coming and fail to protect them on the day, because on October 7, the Israeli military was extremely slow and disorganized in responding to the attack, which let Hamas go on the rampage in these kibbutzim for hours and hours during that day.
Right. So the thinking was, even if they'd been able to breach the border, which of course was conceivable, you would expect that within 5 minutes of hiding out in your bunker, all of these guys should be shot in the head by Israeli snipers.
The military should be there. The Air Force should be stopping them on, before they get to you.
Yeah.
There was a complete failure of Israel's defenses that day. So people who thought they were safe and living under the protection of the Israeli state and military still feel a great, great sense of abandonment and of a breakdown of the state. This is, I think, a very important part of the mood. And I would say that this, something that I've learned from these visits and talking to Israelis is how this taps into the whole Israeli identity and to Jewish history. And this is why October 7 was so triggering for Israelis. Because the whole point of the state of Israel was to protect the Jewish people from being unprotected and at the mercy of people who want to kill them in pogrom type attacks. This was the Jewish experience throughout history of being killed while helpless, while undefended. And the whole point of the state of Israel was to make sure that never happens again. And instead, thousands of Israelis found themselves at the mercy of a kind of pogrom again.
And just pausing on that, Marcus, sorry, have you spoken to military, I'm sure you've spoken to military experts, Israeli military experts, about why it happened?
Yeah. So, among military people, including generals, including some who were involved in responding that day, there is an enormous sense of shame and failure about October 7. They really felt like, yes, this was a complete breakdown. And I think that you have to understand that and how deeply that sits in their psyche to understand everything that has happened since, including the ferocity of Israel's military response in Gaza. And if you spend much time in Israel, you quickly understand that they feel that nobody outside Israel understands this, and understands why this was so traumatic for them. Now, why did that military failure happen? Why did the intelligence, system, the much vaunted agencies, fail to see this? And why was intelligence ignored? Most notoriously, there was an army base manned by mainly female observers of the Israeli military that was monitoring activity inside Gaza and that saw preparations for the attack. They passed on the information and it was ignored. And that military base, Nahal Oz, was overrun on October 7th, and many of those female observers were killed. And some of them are still hostages in Gaza. So this was a momentous failure of the whole system. And Israel has a sense that nobody has really been held to account for this.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt again, but I think I can understand the intelligence failure somewhat. I mean, you've got an experienced jihadist death cult who has learned a lot from its colleagues, presumably in ISIS and elsewhere, and knows that the Israelis are spying on everything, and knows that it needs to handwrite notes, and and has presumably a wealth of support among Hamas areas that it's operating in Gaza. And so I can somehow forgive the intelligence failure. What I don't understand is, do we have a clear idea of why there weren't tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers stationed near Gaza in Israel in case such a thing should happen?
Yes, absolutely. So this gets us into the wider picture of Netanyahu's Israel and what the political priorities were, and Netanyahu's strategy over many years for managing Hamas and Gaza. The fact is that there were very few Israeli troops stationed in that region, in the south, whereas there were a large number of battalions stationed in the West Bank who were protecting the settlers. Now,
these are illegal Israeli towns that have been built on Palestinian land in the West Bank and are being protected by the Israeli military, pretty much in contravention of international law, instead of protecting Israeli civilians who are mostly peaceniks who live near the border of Gaza.
Yeah. So, under under international law, all of the settlements are illegal, and nearly nobody in the world recognizes the annexation of East Jerusalem either. And there are about 500,000 Israeli settlers plus the population of the Jewish population of East Jerusalem, and protecting those settlers and the roads to their settlements and so on took a very large number of Israeli troops. So there were many, many battalions in the West Bank, but there was nearly nothing down south. And the very thinly manned military outposts around Gaza were quickly overrun and butchered. Now, why wasn't there more in the south? That gets us to Netanyahu's strategy for managing Hamas over many years. And here he has faced much blowback for a strategy that, however, it has to be said, was also widely shared inside Israel, in Israeli politics and by the military. And that was to rely on economic development in Gaza, financial incentives, to facilitate money flowing to Hamas from Qatar, which Netanyahu actively encouraged and even lent on the Qataris to continue. And the theory was that basically they can be tamed with a combination of money and occasional airstrikes. And there were exchanges of rockets and Israeli airstrikes, which the Israelis referred to as mowing the grass every now and then. And the theory was that with economic development, the time gap between these short, sharp, mainly air conflicts can grow longer, and that Hamas would become less of a threat. The belief was that it was deterred. Now, this turned out to be an utterly disastrous strategy that completely misread Sinwar and his so Yahya Sinwar, who is now
the head of Hamas,
was released in a hostage exchange by Israel, and quickly went about preparing.
This is years ago, right?
Years ago, yes, that's right. And over the past decade, really imposed his own iron grip on Hamas in Gaza, and he is a psychopath. Basically, he is a fanatic who is utterly convinced of the long-term victory of his side of an Islamist jihad over Israel, and he believes that he is taking steps towards that, even if his generation won't see the final victory.
Now, part of the cynical view of Netanyahu's complacency about Hamas in Gaza is that it actually serves it serves the interests of the far right in Israel to have Hamas in Gaza, because it makes the possibility of a Palestinian state more unacceptable to the rest of the world. It gives them the ability to say, we have no partner for peace. There's Hamas in Gaza, there's the Palestinian Authority, which is this moribund, corrupt organization in the West Bank. Who can we possibly do a deal with? And that if you had a small L liberal, democratic, or as small L liberal and democratic an institution as exists in the in the Arab Muslim world ruling Gaza, then it would increase the pressure on Israeli hawks to talk to them about the possibility of a Palestinian state. Is that true, or is it cynical, or both?
No, it absolutely. Well, it is both cynical and it's true. But this was a strategy, and not only among the far right, some of whose leaders said Hamas is an asset, but Netanyahu too. And I've spoken to people close to him, and they say yes. The theory was that if you keep the Palestinians divided, if Hamas is strong, then you don't need to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, the PA, and you don't need to talk about the two-state solution, which is Netanyahu's least favorite topic. So that was absolutely part of the strategy for managing the Palestinian question. It was this combination of keeping Gaza and the West Bank divided, avoiding negotiations, and believing that a mixture of economic incentives and occasional airstrikes can contain the whole conflict. So there was this idea of managing and containing the conflict with the Palestinians, not solving it.
I mean, it's amazing that you wouldn't follow a precautionary principle, even if that was your outlook. And also, in addition to those things, post tens of thousands of troops in stations along the border. I mean, that's what is extraordinary to me, given what you say about the DNA of the Israeli state being so predicated on the requirement that Israeli lives be free from random terrorism and rape and slaughter from neighbors. Okay. Nonetheless, I think this is
also given the DNA of Hamas, being a movement committed to the destruction of Israel. The belief that it could be tamed with economics was quite extraordinary. But
what do you say to people in the West who say, well, Hamas took the destruction of Israel out of its charter. They're bad guys, but all revolutionary anti-colonial movements are bad guys. Nelson Mandela was palling around with terrorists when South Africa was an apartheid state, and you sort of do what you have to do in order to liberate your people. What do you say to that?
Well, it was clearly wishful thinking in the case of Hamas, and especially in the case of Sinwar. And the thing is, there were plenty of Israelis who knew Sinwar, that they had gotten to know him when he was a prisoner in Israeli prisons for a long, long time. And they knew absolutely that this guy is like a hard-nosed, clear-eyed fanatic who believes in his religious mission to destroy Israel in the long term. And if you look at Sinwar's statements down the years, he viewed the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza as a holding pattern, a temporary thing that might last for a generation, but eventually should be a springboard for driving the Jews out and destroying the Jewish state. So there was a massive amount of wishful thinking here. But I think that October 7 tells us a lot about the complacency in Israel in the last 10 to 15 years, when it really seemed as if the Palestinian question was a secondary question. And Israel thought of itself as this booming tech economy, a startup society. And they believed that after they had defeated the Second Intifada, that the Palestinian question was manageable, and that they could shrink the conflict. They could really reduce it to an ever smaller problem without really answering it, because there was no answer, because there was no partner on the Palestinian side, the Israelis believed. So this is a failure on a par with, and perhaps even bigger than 9/11 in America. After 9/11, there were many Americans asking themselves, how could this complacency have happened? How could the security have been so lax? How could these people trained in Afghanistan have come and done flight courses, in Florida, and said, "Oh, don't bother teaching us how to land. We don't need that part." How did the U.S. agencies fail to pick up on the many, many signs? The same kind of thing happened in Israel last year.
In terms of a failure of imagination.
Yes. a complacency and a failure of imagination that throughout the society and the state and the intelligence agencies that led to them misreading the situation.
Okay, so let's, in some ways, the entire past 20 minutes has just been my interested aside from the original question that I asked you to answer, and then sidetracked you from, which was Hezbollah and Lebanon. So, after the UN agreement not to station rockets in southern Lebanon gets completely ignored, then October 7th happens, October 8th happens, and Hezbollah starts firing on northern Israel. Israel evacuates all of this entire region of the country, and these people are still being housed in hotels. And is it then just sort of somewhat inevitable that at some point they're going to have to take out Hezbollah's rockets? And can they not do that from the air? And is the ground incursion like a strategic entry point to some bigger conflagration that Netanyahu's government is trying to stir up with Hezbollah and Iran? Like, where are we?
Okay, so briefly on the chronology in the past year with Lebanon, Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, miscalculated by thinking that he can keep Israel trapped in this limited war of an exchange of rockets and airstrikes across the border, but within a narrow zone. The problem is that the situation he had created was intolerable, namely the north of Israel was uninhabitable. The Israeli military has been wanting to take on Hezbollah for many months. They wanted to end the war in Gaza, have a ceasefire, get the hostages out, and then hit Hezbollah hard. It was Netanyahu who was dragging his feet on this for many, many months, dragging his feet on the ceasefire deal, often raising new demands, making a ceasefire deal with Hamas more difficult in the eyes of Israel's own negotiators and the frustrated Americans and Arab governments trying to mediate, but also not wanting to take a decision on going to war in Lebanon. Now, this may be because Israel has a very unhappy experience of its wars in Lebanon. In 1978, 82, and 2006, invasions of Lebanon didn't bring Israel the security that it wanted, despite sometimes achieving tactical gains. The ultimate result was not good for Israel. But the military really has been pushing Netanyahu in the direction of escalation in Lebanon. So around the same time that the Gaza war was really winding down to some extent, because it's just really ended up as a kind of whack-a-mole war where the Israelis go back into the same areas again to suppress Hamas's attempts to revive itself. The Israeli military felt that it can now free up enough resources to shift the war to the north. And
when is this? This is a couple of months ago?
Yes. So this is in recent months. And so we get to September, and then the Israeli military really pushed Netanyahu into taking a decision, finally, to go after Hezbollah. And it began, as we saw, with this incredible attack on Hezbollah's pages, their secure communication system that they had bought especially, that they had ordered from a company that turned out to be a front for the Mossad, for Israeli intelligence. And it's still not quite clear because, sources are saying slightly contradictory things, but some in Israel say that there were fears that Hezbollah was growing suspicious about these pages, so that Israel had to decide whether to use it or lose it.
Right.
Yeah, but
do we know
sources,
what the timeline is for an operation like that? I mean, I've assumed that would have been in place before October 7th, but...
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So,
many years. Yeah. So
right.
a lot of what the Israelis have done has really been the fruit of intelligence work and preparations over many, many years. Since the 2006 war, Israel's military and intelligence services have been preparing options, have been trying to infiltrate Hezbollah, with spies, with technology. And so they've been preparing for this for many, many years.
Right. And so in some ways, does this maybe partly loop back to their complacency about Gaza and Hamas, in the sense that they've had their eyes on the prize, which is that there's this formidable military force, which is this Iranian proxy, and there will be a reckoning with Hezbollah. So let's get all of our ducks in a row for that showdown.
They had their intelligence effort focused on Lebanon, and their infantry battalions focus on the West Bank.
Right.
And so in both areas, they neglected Gaza and Hamas.
Good moment to be Sinwar in that situation.
Yeah, look, the Israelis left the door wide open as far as he could see in many ways. Also, Israel's internal political conflict, which, in the months after Netanyahu came back, at the end of 2022, Netanyahu won elections with, a coalition of his Likud party and far-right partners and religious parties, and then began this judicial reform, as they build it, which is really to depower the Israeli judiciary and the Supreme Court. And that led to enormous divisions in Israeli society, where many people felt that he was undermining Israeli democracy, and massive street demonstrations, divisions within the government too. And Sinwar saw this and thought, Israel is a deeply divided society in disarray, and this is his moment to attack.
Right. So the Hezbollah, the pulling the trigger by the Israelis on the degradation or the massive degradation of Hezbollah. I think we all know that anyone who's been reading newspapers over the past couple of months knows roughly what happened. The pages all explode, and then subsequently their mobile phones. The walkie-talkies
the next day.
The walkie-talkies explode. Then there's a targeted strike on the head of Hezbollah, who is assassinated.
It was quite an incredible sequence. Yeah. So the Hezbollah leadership can't phone each other. So they meet in person, and then the Israelis blow them up. And then they seem to have assassinated several other, people. I mean, the next leader, Safiuddin, has also been killed, it appears. And now the most senior official is retaining the title of a deputy general secretary.
I would do the same. Yes. Right. Yes. Yeah. Hezbollah has no leader at the moment. It's not me. Yeah. Yes. I just bring the coffees.
That's pretty much where they are. So
right.
They are in complete disarray at the leadership level, and the Israeli military wants to use this to really go after them. So they have been pounding both the missile arsenal as best they can that Hezbollah had built up. So these these Iranian supplied missiles, which Hezbollah, it was feared, could fire at Israel in such huge numbers that they swamped Israel's air defenses. Those have not been fired. That has not happened. They're still firing, dozens of rockets a day at northern Israel, but the long-range barrages against Israeli cities has not happened. And that may well be because they're in disarray, or because physically the Israelis have managed to take out a lot of those missiles and missile launchers. But this is really, I think the mood in the Israeli military now is carpe diem. We've been preparing for this for years, and this is our chance to take out an extremely, the most dangerous of the enemies on Israel's border.
So they put boots on the ground and they try to clear out southern Lebanon. What is the strategy beyond that? Do we know? Presumably they don't want to occupy southern Lebanon again, I assume. I mean, I don't know if they want to occupy Gaza again.
Do they know is the big question.
Well, yeah.
She is. Yeah.
Right.
If once you start covering Israel, you start thinking there seems to be no strategy here. It's all tactics, but what's the plan? And then you find out that that's actually a cliche, and it's been a recurrent pattern in the history of Israel's conflicts with the Palestinians and with its neighbors. There is no plan. There is no strategy. They are sometimes extremely effective at tactics, at intelligence, at military strikes. But it leads them deeper and deeper into quagmires, and the political gain in terms of actually making Israel more secure can often be very elusive. And that was the case with all three Lebanon wars. And now they're getting themselves to the cusp of a dilemma when they sent in ground troops. What are they doing? They are, for the moment, trying to drive back Hezbollah forces from the border and destroy their arms caches. So in a lot of tunnels, Hezbollah have built underground near the border. They have large stashes of these Russian Kornet missiles and other weaponry. So they're trying to blow that up. Okay, but then what? If they pull out, then Hezbollah can come back when there's a ceasefire, which there will be eventually. They just rebuild. And then the threat will simply return. If they hold the ground, however, then they will be back into the business of occupying southern Lebanon.
Why
which
isn't there a third option, Marcus, which is that you actually implement what the United Nations said should be implemented in 2006, but you don't you don't place an unfair burden on the Lebanese army to do it? Why can't you get the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis and, I don't know, the Jordanians under, French military supervision, since the French claim to care so much about, their former colonial areas, to create a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, which they just sit there and make sure that Hezbollah don't... Like, everyone claims to care so much about this conflict and to care so much about the Palestinians, but when it comes to simple things that the international community could do, like not make it a binary choice between either Israeli occupation or jihadist groups firing rockets into Israel, there's, it's tumbleweed.
Wait, so we haven't yet seen this discussion about southern Lebanon, about international actors or other Arab states sending troops. We have seen it about Gaza. So for many, many months, there's been much discussion about what combination of the Palestinian Authority and perhaps soldiers from other Arab states could play a role in a post-Hamas regime in Gaza. But nothing has happened there. And nobody...
Isn't that incredibly hypocritical of the Arab world? They claim to care about the Palestinians.
Well, nobody wants to put boots in the ground and then be shot at by Hamas. That's one thing.
Yeah, no shit.
But also, everybody outside Israel wants the Palestinian Authority to play a leading role in the governance of Hamas. But Netanyahu has said absolutely no way those guys should play no role. And his far-right coalition partners are adamantly against it, and they instead want to return to Israel occupying Gaza, or at least a part of it, and to rebuilding settlements in Gaza, or a part of it. So really, it is more the political disagreement over who should rule Gaza that has led to that discussion going nowhere. In the case of Lebanon, no one is yet talking about third parties coming in, except for the UN. Really, there's this UN peacekeeping force, UNIFIL, which has been there forever, and however, has been utterly unable and unwilling to really challenge Hezbollah's control of the territory. They've played more of an observer role than anything else. No, the problem is that Lebanon is a broken state with a deeply divided society, and that there is no actor that is able or even willing to push aside Hezbollah right now.
Well, there are actors who are able, surely. I mean, I say the French slightly in jest, but a large Western military would be able to presumably just create a buffer in which Hezbollah rockets can't be installed, couldn't they?
Nobody wants to get themselves into an endless guerrilla war, which is what the Israeli military doesn't want to do either. It's easy to send in troops and take the ground. Then you find people are shooting at you, and you're stuck there. The Israelis occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years until they pulled out in 2000 after having.
But of course, people shoot at you if you're Israeli. People might not shoot at you if you're an Arab. If you're an Arab coalition.
The French and the Americans sent peacekeepers into Lebanon and were attacked in the early 1980s, and were attacked, by Islamists, by Hezbollah, and were killed in large numbers in bombings in Beirut. And so they don't have a good memory of the experience of sending peacekeepers into Lebanon. Yeah. The problem is that the Lebanese state doesn't really have the means to push Hezbollah aside. The Lebanese army, the army of the official government, is weaker than Hezbollah, and it's also a conscript army that recruits from the Shia population as well. So if it were ever ordered to take on Hezbollah, it would split into two and lose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a non-starter. It's also just unfair to expect. Like, Lebanon is so torn apart, by its proximity to Israel and the meddling of Iran, that it has enough to deal with without requiring it to.
Maybe we'll see this kind of discussion. I doubt that it will be like French or American troops playing a peacekeeping role. Perhaps we'll see some discussion about the role of other Arab countries. I'm
not saying it's likely, Marcus. I'm just saying it doesn't accord with the way the world claims to care about the issue. Like, you just have to talk about Israel anywhere on the Arab street, and you can whip up 100,000 people to be marching in the streets screaming about it as if it's the most important thing that they care about. You can talk to anyone wearing a veil in Sydney about Palestine, and they say that it's like the most important thing to them as a Muslim to support their Muslim friends. But when it comes to actually sending money or shedding any blood on their behalf in order to secure the situation, they don't give a shit. And I wonder if it's just because they want Israel to go away.
Well, obviously, there's a huge gap between Arab governments and populations in much of the sunny Arab world. The governments, which are generally authoritarian governments, don't really have a problem with Israel. And before October 7, we're on a track towards normalizing relations. In the case of more and more countries with Israel, they want to do business with it. They want Israeli technology, and they want a security arrangement with the US, which was part of the package, aimed at containing Iran, which is seen as more of a regional threat. However, the populations feel very differently. So a lot of these Arab leaders, such as MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he seems to tell every visitor who comes that he doesn't give a damn about the Palestinians personally, but his society is so angry about Gaza that if he pursued normal diplomatic relations with Israel now, he would be assassinated. Then
just call the Arab streets bluff and say, all right, it's got nothing to do with the Crown Prince, but we're going to have an international coalition where you can conscript yourself and you can put your hand up to be a peacekeeper in Gaza. You guys on the Arab street in Riyadh say that you care so much about the Palestinians. You can come and join a volunteer army that will be peacekeeping in Gaza and in southern Lebanon. Go at it.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Israelis would be so keen on a volunteer army of a volunteer militia of people grabbed from all over the Arab world. That's a sort of like peacekeeping Al Qaeda. It would sound like that to Israel, I think. In the case of money, it's a different question. I mean, the Gulf countries are willing to put in money, and they have been putting in money. I mean, they financed Gaza in the last 15 years, and they've also been financing the PA. However, they are very frustrated about the corruption of the PA, and they want to know who will be governing. Basically, they want a reformed PA with corruption cleaned out to rule both the Palestinian territories, Gaza and the West Bank. So money is a different matter from peacekeeping or sending in a stabilization army.
Yeah, I mean, money is an easy way to make it look like you're doing something without actually having any skin in the game. I mean, another obvious thing that they could do is the UAE and Qatar have insatiable appetites for workers, and they ship in millions of people from Bangladesh and Pakistan to build their stadiums and their airports. They could provide working visas to Palestinians to come and do those jobs. Why aren't they doing that?
Well, there is this long-running sort of Israeli critique of these Arab countries that says, why don't they give permanent residency status to the many Palestinians who are now second or third generation refugees? Why are they kept in this refugee status?
Well, there's that too. Yeah, I mean, it's like the guy who we met, Marcus and I, to the listener now, went to Lebanon a few years ago. And I remember we met that bloke that Palestinian bloke in a suburb in Beirut who, you ask him what he is, and he is a Palestinian, but he's never been to Palestine. His parents have never been to Palestine. He's a stateless descendant of people who were once in the territory that is now Israel, and yet he can't be. Lebanon won't allow him to be a fully fledged Lebanese citizen. He can't travel. He can't. That's ridiculous. That's like me saying that I'm Polish, and Australia not giving me full rights as an Australian because my grandparents were kicked out of a Polish village by the Nazis.
Yeah. I think this system of maintaining, Palestinian refugees, obviously it's deeply unjust in the countries where they live, where there are great limits on the jobs they can do. They can't really become full members of the countries where they're living. such as in Lebanon. But also it has been, I think, pretty unhelpful in terms of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, because it has helped to perpetuate this idea that one day there will be a great return of the refugees. And this, the idea of return and of a right of return has made it very difficult both for Israel to negotiate a settlement and also for Palestinian leaders who wanted a two-state solution to sign a formula and then go back to their people and say, sorry guys, there won't be a great return. You're not going to return to your village, which no longer exists. You're going to be a citizen of a state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital, because there's a large part of the Palestinian population for whom the inherited ambition is to return to historic Palestine.
Right. So if it's a precondition of solving this mess that you disabuse them of that notion, how do you do that? Because the Israeli right thinks you do that by winning, by crushing all of their aspirations and making it obvious to them that that's never going to happen. And most of the rest of the world thinks you do that by being compassionate and, being the bigger party and extending an olive branch and trying and, swallowing your pride and accepting the risk of creating a Palestinian state. And you make them a real offer and you go back and you try again and you keep trying until something sticks.
Well, many people on the Israeli right, don't want to reconcile the Palestinians to, having a small state of Palestine in the West Bank and in Gaza at all. They want the West Bank for Israel, and they would very much welcome it if other countries made the descendants of Palestinian refugees residents and citizens of their own countries. The argument you often hear from people on the Israeli right is there are so many Arab countries. There's only one Jewish country. Palestinians should go to one of the many other Arab countries. So it would be very convenient from the point of view of the Israeli right if the Palestinian diaspora were absorbed and lost its Palestinian national aspirations.
Would
and
they?
Indeed,
do you think, Marcus, they would like want to give Gaza to Egypt and if you could snap your fingers and if the Netanyahu Likudniks and the people to his right, if you could say to them, okay, the West Bank becomes a demilitarized part of Jordan, with entry checkpoints between Jordan proper, but it's all part of Jordan, and you lose it, and the settlers leave, and Gaza becomes Egypt, and then there's no more talk about a Palestine. Do you think they take that deal?
No, I don't think anyone has really wanted that. I mean, that was the situation between 1949 and 1967. Right? Egypt controlled Gaza, and Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. No, I don't think anyone's really calling for that to happen again. In terms of Gaza,
I'm not saying are they calling for it. I'm saying would that
no
be?
No one would want it. No one would want it. No. I mean, the diminishing share of Israeli society that wants a peace settlement or that believes one is feasible supports the two-state solution, meaning a state of Palestine in the West Bank, or at least most of the West Bank, and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital, or at least some of East Jerusalem. Right? That's about as far as the Israeli peace camp, such as it still is willing to go. Whereas the Israeli right, either they want to annex the West Bank, or they want to have this sort of de facto undeclared annexation with the continued growth of settlements and the Palestinians either leaving or accepting a subordinate status within this undeclared Greater Israel. Now, Gaza, the far right wants to, the leading politicians on the far right want to bring back settlements into Gaza, which Israel withdrew from in 2005 when it pulled out its settlers and troops. They want to go back.
And just to remind people, there were Jewish Israeli towns in Gaza. Yes. Like, I think sometimes people think that the pullout in 2005 was a military pullout because there had been some kind of security operation that the army had been involved in Gaza. But it wasn't just that. There were settlements. No. I mean, there were Israelis.
There were settlements. There was a relatively small number of settlers compared with the West Bank, which was why it was relatively easy for Ariel Sharon, the prime minister at the time, to pull them out. Even so, that there was much resistance from the settlers at the time, but they pulled out because the security burden of protecting the small number of settlers in this densely populated Gaza, an extremely hostile Gaza Strip, just made no sense from Israel's point of view. But the ideologues of Greater Israel on the far right, including some people in Netanyahu's coalition, want to annex the northern part of Gaza under one proposal and bring back settlements there. And part of their rationale is that this would be an apt punishment for October 7. The belief is that Sinwar would recognize his defeat only if he loses land. So this kind of discourse is out there on the Israeli right too.
And how do they reconcile that with a long-term, like the long-term sustainability of the Israeli state? Like, coming back to your point about like, what is the strategy? Like, what is the long-term strategy for a secure Israel if it absorbs demographically a large number of Arabs in the West Bank? If all Palestinians become essentially Israelis, even if you treat them as second-class citizens, I mean, are they imagining a state which is essentially a formalized apartheid state where Jews are, where Arabs have to wear some version of a Star of David, a yellow Star of David on their jackets in order to not be allowed, sit up the back of buses or something? Like, what are they envisaging? How do you retain a liberal democratic Israeli state if you are sitting on top of the West Bank and Gaza?
So I would say that overall in Israel, there are very few answers except on the far right. The far right has a clear answer to this, which is what? The land is all ours, and they need to either accept subordinate status. For example, the Palestinians in the West Bank might have local autonomy. They might be able to vote in their local elections, but they wouldn't be able to vote in elections for the national parliament, for the Knesset. So they accept second-class citizen status.
And can they travel into Israel, or do they stay behind the wall?
Well, yeah, that depends on, these are not thought-through proposals, but the general vision would be that they have to accept inferior status or leave. Right? But in most of Israeli society and politics, there is simply no answer. And this is something that no answer in terms of what is the long-term, what's the end game? And this was expressed rather vehemently in a rant the other day by the Jordanian foreign minister when he was speaking at the UN. He said, you ask any senior Israeli official, like, what is your end game? How is this supposed to, what's your solution on the Palestinian questions? And you simply do not get an answer. And he expressed the frustration of many Sunni Arab governments that, many countries in the region are waiting really for Israel to join the region, to have normal diplomatic relations, to become part of the club, to trade. And really, all that is needed is an answer on the Palestinian question, which has to be a revival of the two-state solution. But, Israeli politics has simply turned against that. That was what the Jordanian foreign minister was saying. And it's true, the two-state solution in Israel is pretty much dead politically, as it is among the Palestinians for the time being. And there is no alternative answer. That is why this idea of managing the conflict grew into the dominant discourse. Not solving it, but containing it, coping with it from year to year.
I mean, it's just like incredibly depressing when you hear it put like that. I mean, I suppose to be as generous as possible to the pro-Israeli, well, I hate using that term because it sort of equates right-wing Israelis with Israel, but the harsh on Palestinian perspective, when you say like there's no strategy, like what's the long-term strategy? Everything is tactical and it doesn't solve the problem. The Israelis might say, well, we had a strategy. It was that when the British put an end to British Palestine, there was going to be a Jewish state and an Arab state, and instantaneously the Arabs invaded. And so we tried to do our best, and then they invaded again 20 years later and tried to kill us all. And then 6 years after that, they tried to kill us all over again. And we tried to grope our way towards some kind of an accommodation as they were blowing up our planes and school buses over the course of decades. And nonetheless, we made offers to recognize a state over the course of the 90s and 2000s. And we didn't receive a single counteroffer. We didn't even receive unreasonable counteroffers. We just received total crickets and nothing. So there was a strategy,
of course.
And there is no So what do you expect us to do exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is that narrative, and that has even been dominant, almost monopolistic, since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. And the story is, we repeatedly.
And just explain the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada came after Yasser Arafat walked away from.
That reading in itself. So let's go back to the 1990s. You had the Oslo Accords, and Israel, under sort of U.S. mediation, Israelis and the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, did this deal whereby the PLO became the party that ran it, Fatah, became the governing party of a new Palestinian authority in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. So they got a kind of local autonomy, and in return, they recognized Israel, and they helped the Israelis on security. So they became their security partners, tasked with arresting, jihadi terrorists from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And the Palestinian hope was that this would be the embryo of a Palestinian state. But the final status, peace talks never really came about because trust on both sides collapsed. On the Palestinian side, they were unable and perhaps also unwilling to really put an end to terrorism, which increased under the Oslo years. And on the Israeli side, they were unable and unwilling to take on the settler lobby. Instead, the settler population in the West Bank actually doubled during the Oslo years. And the Palestinians saw this and said, hang on, are you talking to us in good faith if you're eating up the land that is supposed to become the Palestinian state? So, trust on both sides collapsed. And then there was this notorious summit in the year 2000 at Camp David, where Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, failed to answer all of the difficult, final status questions. And the Israeli narrative is, we offered them everything, they said no and chose terrorism. But I think that in reality, there was a lot of blame to go around on the Palestinian side, the Israeli side, and the American side, who did a terrible job as mediators. Fundamentally,
Bill Clinton's perspective is certainly that it was Arafat's fault. He writes in his autobiography that Arafat said to him, "You're a great man, Mr. President," and he said to Arafat, "No, I'm a failure, and you made me one."
Well, Clinton wanted his legacy at that moment. He wanted, a Middle East peace deal to be his greatest legacy, and so he was very frustrated, as were some of his people. But fundamentally, there are four different difficult issues when it comes to the two-state solution.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.